Okay, let's talk about the blue tarp. And the reason I'm bringing this up is a lot of people have come into the comments and mentioned the tarp, asked about, didn't he douse it with gasoline? Didn't he cover it with fertilizer? Wasn't he trying to hide all the evidence on the tarp? And I had said from the very beginning that this was an evidence-based area and that I would look pretty unkindly to people spreading misinformation. But it occurred to me that I don't think when it comes to the tarp, anybody's intentionally spreading misinformation. I think it's that we just don't know the truth about the tarp. And I know for 20 years, I've thought something completely different than what I just read in the testimony. So I just want to clarify this in case anybody has questions about the blue tarp. And of course, what the police assumed is that the morning of the 24th, Scott took Lacey's body out of the home and put it into the truck, and that he wrapped it in the tarp to do so. And then they thought that he put the umbrellas on top. So in the back of the truck, they piled the umbrellas in there on top of her to disguise what was in there. And a neighbor did see him loading the umbrellas. So the police believe that he got the boat. He then drove to the marina. And then when he got to the marina, he dumped Lacey in the water and then brought the tarp back home. Now, see, this is where my first bit of misinformation came from, because I've always believed, and I think I even said this in an earlier video, I honestly pictured in my head when they say she was wrapped in a tarp and then they found duct tape on her, I honestly pictured her to be wrapped in the tarp and duct taped up like a package with the weights or the anchors inside and then put like that into the water. But the blue tarp didn't end up in the water with Lacey. It ended up back home at Scott's house, or so that's what the police have discovered. They find the blue tarp in his garage and then, of course, put it through all types of testing so they could see what was on the tarp. Now, this is pulled out of the evidence list, and it says it's a blue tarp from the large shed. It was found on December 27th, that it was collected by Detective Rudy Scoltetti, who I like to call Rudy Scaluti because it's just easier for me to remember. He is the crime scene manager. It's item number 41, blah, blah, blah. You can see the reason it was suspected of being used to conceal Lacey's body. Then it was given over, it was received by the DOJ crime laboratory on December 30th, and that is Pincayo who did the testing, and the testing was done on January 9th. The result is negative, so let's talk through that. And you can pause to read this, but I'm just gonna glance through this. So Pincayo did the testing, right? She attached the following pictures, these pictures here. She describes the blue tarp as having a mildew smell and observed sawdust, dirt, and pollen, like part of a flower, like that type of pollen, and a greenish stain, which she concluded was a grass stain. She also found 2 long hairs, some shorter hairs that were possibly animal hairs, and fibers. The tarp had 2 stains, which were tested both negative for blood. She also confirmed that the tarp had no tissue or other trace evidence. She sent the hairs to a criminalist named Rodney Oswald for examination, but he did not report the findings in his testimony. Coyote, when she testified, she said there was no indication that the tarp had been contaminated or any trace evidence damaged or destroyed by being in the shed with home garden fertilizer products. Now, here's the conclusion down below. Let me move my head. So if you can see here, it says, had the blue tarp been used to wrap Lacey's dead body for transport, it would have been laden with trace evidence, especially if Lacey had already been dead for 12 hours or so, and nearly 100 pounds of umbrellas were placed on top of her. But the tests performed by Cayo found no trace evidence whatsoever, and Cayo offered no expert testimony that its presence in the shed would have removed such trace evidence. There are a lot of people who believe that he did something to that tarp to remove the trace evidence off of it. Pincayo testified that there was no evidence that anything was done, like there was no tampering or other solutions added to that tarp that would cause that to happen. And then the state of California never brought in any other expert to prove that as well, because they could have brought in somebody that said, here's how gasoline or fertilizer would destroy evidence. They didn't bring in a specialist to show that. There are multiple pictures, and there's actually a picture where the tarp is hung up, and you can see a person's handwriting pointing to everything, like, here's a stain, here's this, here's that, and it explains what everything is. Like, all the photos show every single stain and what it ended up being. Here's the hairs. So they photographed the entire thing the entire time, so there really wasn't any evidence on the blue tarp. Now, let me just say one more thing, is that there was a second tarp, and I don't want to confuse people, but because this really isn't anything, but let me just talk about it. When Lacey's torso, excuse me, I'm sorry, trigger alert, I know that is horrible to hear. When her torso was found, there was a clear plastic, what was described as like a big plastic bag that was found nearby that had some tape on it. One of the Marina police called the police and smells, he said, and I'm sorry again, trigger alert, he said it smells like death. So they tested it and they found it had no trace evidence or anything on it that would have connected it to the body. It was a completely separate bag. In fact, the plastic of the bag and the tape that was around that bag was a different brand of tape than was found on Lacey. So there was no reason to believe. In fact, the manufacturer of that bag, clear plastic bag, is often used in shipping containers. So when there's ships that have big shipping containers, they often use that type of plastic to wrap around shipments. And so they believe that that somehow washed ashore. So there is the mystery of the blue tarp. Now we all know, and I'm glad that I'm reading all of this because I have spent 20 years probably believing a lot like you did that there was something to this blue tarp, and apparently that they didn't have evidence that there was any trace of Lacey on it.